My father didn't know a speck of Spanish moving down there. It was probably one of our biggest worries. I mean, how disorienting would that be to move to a place where you don't speak the language? So I have actually an excerpt from it that you can see the closeness through his aides. Well, his doctor spoke English, which I think was really useful for them assessing him. But his aides they tried to learn some English, and it was kind of funny. They were learning the English, but they would watch soap operas with my dad, and we had cable service, and we got Discovery Channel in English, because I'm like, I want my dad to know like what he's watching. But when we go away, they would switch the channels to the soap operas in Spanish. And then I'd come back, and there they would be. And I was mad, and I would turn it back. And I'm like, Senor John, Mr. John wants to watch Discovery Channel. But interestingly enough, he ended up learning beginning Spanish, both understanding it and responding. And that was phenomenal.
Welcome to the All's Authors podcast. We're so glad you found us. We're the global community of authors writing about Alzheimer's and dementia from personal experience to light the way for others. I'm Mary Ann Shuko, a registered nurse, author, and dementia daughter.
And I'm Christy Byrne-Yates, a licensed educational psychologist, dementia daughter, OWL's author, and coach focused on the sandwich generation. Please join us for bi-weekly episodes with our authors as we talk about their dementia journeys, sharing intimate details and painfully obtained knowledge to help others currently on that path.
We hope these stories offer you comfort and support as we strive to break the silence and stigma surrounding a dementia diagnosis.
May one of our authors speak to your experience.
This is the Whole Care Network. Helping you tell your story one podcast at a time. Content presented in the following podcast is for information purposes only. Views and opinions expressed in this podcast are solely those of the host and guest and may not represent the views and opinions of the Whole Care Network. Always consult with your physician for any medical advice, and always consult with your attorney for any legal advice. And thank you for listening to the Whole Care Network.
Hi, I'm Susan Landis of All's Authors. If you're listening to this podcast, you may be looking for more support on your dementia journey. Please visit our website at allsauthors.com, where you'll find hundreds of carefully vetted resources written by caregivers and professionals in Alzheimer's and dementia care. You'll get knowledge, comfort, and support through books, blogs, podcasts, films, and more. That's allsauthors.com. Remember, you are not alone.
Hi, Christy. Welcome back to the All's Authors podcast.
Hi, Mary Ann. Excited to be here. This will be fun and interesting.
Yes, we have a very interesting guest today. Her name is Barbara Drake-Vera, and she is the author of Melted Away, a memoir of climate change and caregiving. And she joins us from Florida, but her caregiving journey happened in South America, in Peru, where she lived with her husband and her father, who was, as she described him, a staunch World War II veteran American, stuck in his ways, and in his dementia journey ended up having to leave the United States to live with his daughter and her husband. She was the only child. So they realized a few interesting things over there. They learned, while they had been living there for a while, her husband was a native Peruvian. They discovered that caregiving is quite different there than it is in the United States. And one of the key factors is that it is very affordable.
Yes, yes.
Affordable. Yes, that was the key thing. So that's why they decided to have her dad come and stay with them. Um, and move him to a new country with a new language and culture and everything, which is kind of like what you're told not to do with a person with dementia.
Right, right, right. But so what's so fascinating is it's not even just that it's more affordable. And this is not to say that it's, everybody has to do this or
Mhm.
anything like that, but it was more affordable. But she also noticed the culture is built around sort of that multi-generational living, that people caring for elders is part of living. And I think that's something that's really interesting too. And it changes then how caregivers interacted with her father. So that was really, so she has a lot to tell us and we have a lot to learn. And I found that really fascinating too. And just and such a provocative title, right? So we're going to hear a little bit in her book about climate change, which was fascinating, and then her father, his some of his. She described him at one point as cantankerous, and that melting away there, and how dementia changed him, and in a way that he became more accessible to her. So it's
Right,
great.
right.
Yeah,
They had had a fractured relationship in the
yeah.
past. It was very difficult for her to decide whether or not to take on the responsibility of his care, but she knew that she could do it and they could do it well. So she was up for the task. And in the end, what happened was a melting away of the old angers and animosities that had consumed them in the past and over the years. She was really grateful for that. So she's going to tell us about that. And we're going to learn all about caregiving in Lima, Peru. And she's just a very lovely person.
Yeah, yeah, very good. It's a great conversation. I'm really glad to offer this to everybody. So, yeah, terrific.
Okay, let's get started.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to Al's Authors podcast. And I want to welcome Barbara Drake-Vera. I'm so excited to have you here, and also excited to see Marianne again. Welcome. How are you both?
Great. Thank you so much for having me here, Christy and Marianne. I love being part of All's Authors, and I'm very excited to talk about my book and my unique caregiving experience with you guys.
Well, that's great. Thank you so much for being here and for letting us promote your book for you.
Yeah, yeah, we're excited. This is a great topic and very unique, what you're going to share with us today.
Mhm.
And so I want to, I guess, ask you to start off by talking to us a little bit about like you lived in Peru and you were doing some amazing work. So maybe you can talk a little bit about how you got there, and then talk to us a little bit how you started caring for your dad.
Okay, great. Yeah, thank you. So my book is Melted Away. Here it is. And you can see from this down here, and it's on the spine, it's this Andean fabric. And my book is set in Peru, and it describes my and my husband's unique caregiving journey, caring for my American father with Alzheimer's in Peru about, like 12 years ago, or in the land of the Incas, as he called it. So people probably want to know, why did you bring him to Peru? What in the world would ever make you do a thing like that? I married a Peruvian. I met him in the United States. Hurricane Andrew brought him from the Midwest, where he had been living and working for the American Red Cross. So he was one of the few people, he was living in Missouri, and Red Cross is stationed in Missouri, in St. Louis. And when Hurricane Andrew came, he was brought from St. Louis down to Miami because he spoke Spanish. And at that time, the Red Cross did not have a lot of Spanish speakers. So that's how my husband ended up in Miami, and that's where I met him. So we married a few years later. We lived in Florida together, and then we moved to North Central Florida, to Northern Florida. Yeah, North Central Florida. And it was there that my parents came. This is the whole backstory for people who want to know. My mother and father moved in 2001 to Gainesville to be closer to us and to our child. We have a son, and he does not appear in the book. And I'm happy to talk about why he doesn't appear in the book later. Let's just say that there was a lot that I had to narrow down for the book. And so someone who read it, a memoirist, suggested, she goes, well, too much, get rid of the son. So anyway, but with our son, that's why we live here. And we were there in North Central Florida, and it's described in the book. But ultimately, my mom died and my father was left there. So he had his big 4-bedroom house, and everything was going great for him there. And we fell on hard economic times. So my father increasingly became more difficult behaviorally. And people who know Alzheimer's and the progression of dementias will understand that often the behavioral changes come before the obvious memory changes. So I interpreted all that through the lens of my father, whom I had a hard relationship with, is becoming just more of a jerk, and I couldn't stand it. And so my husband lost his job. I was working as an adjunct, and I was just getting more and more mad. I'm like, can we move in with you? And he said no. But again, he was in the early stages of dementia and making bad decisions. So my husband and I were like, we're going to go to Peru. He had a job opportunity there. So we left in 2007. And we were living there for about 3.5 years. And then in early 2011, my father was finally diagnosed with Alzheimer's. They didn't stage it. And long story short, it was difficult for us to care for him there. And we made the unusual decision to bring him to Peru and have him cared for first in our home, because there's a large and long tradition of caring for elders in your home there. And there's besides the city of Beijing, which is number one, Lima has the most at-home caregivers per capita of any country in the world. We didn't move there knowing that, but that's what it was. So, but again, we didn't know any expats who'd done this. We just noticed from what people did. And we brought my father in March of 2011 to live with us in Lima and to be cared for in our home. And
Wow.
a lot of Melted Away talks about this experience of bringing a World War II vet, a very kind of standoffish, proud, independent American man, and what it's like to care for somebody within a Latin culture. So that's what we did. And he lived with us. He lived with us in Lima for about 10 months, and then we had to transition him to a care home. There's about 19 people there. It was run by one of his doctors, a gerontologist, and it was the most amazing caregiving experience. So that was it. And my father passed away in 2012, 18 months later, from heart trouble.
Wow.
But that's it. So over the process of that time, a lot of things were happening. One of which was it actually helped my relationship with my father. But you asked Christy about what I was doing before. I'm a journalist, and I was down there doing freelance work, writing about many different things, culture down there, but one of them was writing about environmental changes. And there is a glacier pilgrimage that happens there, and the glacier was melting due to climate change. So we're talking like the 2000s, and climate change was not as present in Americans' lives as it is now. But those people up in the highlands of Peru were on the front lines of climate change. So I was writing about how it was impacting them, impacting the environment, and I loved doing that. It was a hard sell to get American newspaper editors to run stories on it. They're like, who cares? It's like as far away as like the polar bears, like off in the Antarctic. So I could sell stories on other things. So actually I took on jobs. I ended up becoming a field producer for NBC News about that stuff. But
Wow.
it was it was pretty amazing.
Well, and thanks for that. And I'm glad you kept at it, because here we are.
Yeah.
And still we're not grasping the whole story, are we? But anyway,
Yeah.
yeah,
So,
fascinating.
yeah, but how that ties into caregiving, many people write books about caregiving, and caregivers know that your other life goes on. And so the whole balancing act, if you're working, what do I do? How do I work and coordinate the care or care? Part of what I had to do is I had to stop reporting on events in the Andes. I just couldn't go running up to the Andes while my dad was, like kind of in free fall, even though we had people caring for him in the house. We did that. So that's the book is really about a lot of caregiving, with my awareness of what's going on up there and yearning to return to those glaciers that are melting away, just like kind of like my dad's cognition was also melting away due to those larger forces.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, those are amazing connotations.
Yeah, it's a beautiful metaphor, I think, and I don't know. It's so rich with different ways you can look at it, but I feel like it's important to talk about these things, about how difficult it can be, and you also mentioned at the top about the culture in South America, in Peru, and I don't know if this is specific to Peru, but I think in many cultures, multi-generational living and caregiving is the norm, and we're seeing some of that return very slightly in the United States too. That was a phenomenon from COVID. A lot of people moved in together because grandma and grandpa got kids on Zoom school and mom and dad were on Zoom working. And so there were all these different ways that people cooperated. So it's interesting that you were already in a place where that's embedded in the culture. So that's interesting.
Yeah, absolutely, Christy. I mean, having your elders in your house is the norm throughout South America. Of course, the burden falls a lot to women. I mean, women take on a lot of things, so that's really true. But the other thing was, it was very normal to go into someone's house and there's an elder in the back room, like in these, and they are often like brought in. There was even an Italian restaurant. This lovely man in Lima, at an Italian restaurant. Oh my God, he was such a good cook. But his mom with Alzheimer's she was a fixture, and he would turn on the television and she would just like watch television, and he would cook up these amazing meals. So you mentioned like bringing throughout Latin America. I just found in general in Latin America that it was much more acknowledged of having to care for elders in whatever they had, not just dementia, anything. And this reality was just sort of reflected. I mean, I would talk to people at work and they're like, oh, yeah, like my aunt or my husband's father, he's living with us. Whereas in the United States, I have still found that people are quieter about their caregiving. I mean, you can work with people you might not know for years that they are caring for a mother or somebody with dementia. And I guess I'd say there's stigma attached to it here. And so that was the difference that I found, was both the culture, it was much more in the norm. I could talk about it really freely. Here, to find the people I could talk about it, I had to like join a group like the Alzheimer's Association, it was much more like that.
Yeah. One of the groups I work with, Whole Care Network, who hosts our podcast, by the way.
Thank you, Whole Care Network.
Yeah, so we have a group there that is targeted to talk to employers about caregiving, and that's one of the things. And people are afraid sometimes. People don't identify at work that they're caregivers. In some ways, it's stigma, but in some ways, it's more about, I don't want my employers to know because then I might be at risk for not getting promoted, not getting, being micromanaged because I'm making too many phone calls, or I'm taking too many days away or half days or things like that. And people, that's changing ever so slightly, like a glacier. It is moving like a glacier. But that's exactly what we're addressing, is that very thing. And I think when it's embedded in a culture, then, of course, workplaces are part of the culture. I think it's, and you mentioned somebody who had a mother who was at the restaurant, and I have a friend here in my area that I know whose mother had Alzheimer's, and she had started a very popular restaurant here. And when she could no longer cook, she was there every night still. She had her table. Everybody knew her. Everybody said hello to her.
Interesting.
So there are things we can do.
Right. Yeah, like integrating people. But of course, everybody with dementia is different. And some people can be integrated. So like that's it. But when you see someone else doing something like that, I think it empowers others, maybe even just like a boss saying, I have to go care for my mother or something like that. I mean, bosses, the culture is, because it's top down.
Yes.
So I remember when I was working, I mean, you can even find this out about leaders. Like when I was a volunteer with the Alzheimer's Association in Florida for 3 years. And one of the things that I found out from leadership at the Alzheimer's Association was we were able to get the governor on board with a lot of things like training for law enforcement because the governor's mother had Alzheimer's, right? So he didn't talk about this, but that kind of awareness can trickle down and really make an impact on things.
It's true.
Yeah.
I had a question for you. One of the cardinal rules in caregiving is to not upset the person's environment, that people will do better with the familiarity of their home and their routines. And we do know of other authors who have not followed that advice, such as yourself. And what did you experience from that? I mean, how did he react to his change? I mean, it was a huge change in environment for him, obviously. Had he ever been to Peru or out of the country before? What was his reaction to the whole thing?
Okay, great. Thank you. That's a really good question, Marianne. Undoubtedly, bringing my father to Peru was a really big unknown. He really wanted to stay in his house, although he would not let us live with him, right? So he ultimately had to move somewhere. And we knew that we could care for him best and do the best job. But there was a really rough initial period. There's a big chapter in the book called 40 Days. This is the chapter that caregivers will like, because it's when you're in those first months in the trenches and you're like, what am I doing? My dad did not respond well to it initially. He became worse, and the violence came out in my father initially. But it was also my father's initial trauma wasn't just taking him to Peru. My father had not been treated for Alzheimer's. Nothing in his life, in his old life, had changed. There had been no accommodations. There had been no interventions. So part of what went on during that initial period was getting him connected with the right doctors, the right medication, creating a stable routine for my father at home. So at Marianne, it was rough initially, but he had such a great routine and such good care that, after 40 days, everything became normal. And I think also it depends when you catch people with dementia. Like, he had like moderate advancing Alzheimer's, but he kind of forgot mainly about his life in the United States pretty quickly. And he knew he was in Peru, and he would be like, okay, so my insurance is paying for this. Yeah, and I'm thinking, no, it's not. But like, yeah, fine. So his world became his room, and his nurses caring for him. So in some ways, he wasn't sightseeing. He wasn't going to Machu Picchu or anything. His room became his little room and everything. And that regularity was what sustained him So you talk about the difficulties of moving. There was a second transition for my dad when he went from our home, we had a two-story home. We were renting, this is going to sound crazy. We were renting a two-story house from the 1940s in the center of Lima for less than $800 a month.
Oh my
And
gosh.
so we could like mark off all this space for my dad, but we had to move him into this care home. But so we got really worried about what was going to happen to him. And then I read, as I describe in the book, I read an article on the Alzheimer's website, you know, how do you transition your loved one? And it said, replicate their room down to the detail. So we had, as I described, we had a morning where we kept my father in the garden. There was a big garden out back with a fig tree that was supposedly brought by Francisco Pizarro. Yeah. And so this fig tree, he was out there. And then we got all the movers. We moved all his furniture. We had painted the room in his new care home to look exactly like it. We set everything up. So we replicated it down to the T. And then we just said, hey, Dad, we're going to the doctors. He went, all right. And he got in the cab with his aides. And we went there, and he was in this brand new place. So I go up the stairs. You know, again, he was at a stage where I don't think someone with early dementia would have been fooled, right?
Mhm.
But we went up the stairs, and then he just sat down in his lounge chair and turned the television, and he just, all his same aides were with him, and he was like, okay, this is great. So yes, we were concerned about it. It was
Mhm.
disruptive initially, but he had been not cared for correctly for a number of years before that ultimately he relaxed into it. So
I had a few more questions. What kind of caregiving did he have prior to that when you were living in Peru and he was still in the United States? Was there anything going on, and who was managing that?
I love your question, Marianne. That's such a nice question.
Oh, thanks.
His care, I need to put quotation marks around it. His care was, quote, managed by his geriatrician. And I said to the geriatrician, so remember, I knew nothing about dementia. And I'm like, I didn't think about it. But before we left for Peru, I said to the geriatrician, look, can you do cognitive tests on my father and let me know if anything happens? The geriatrician it was just like quick in, quick out, and my father, he was smart, like people can be in the early stages of dementia.
Mhm.
So as I describe in the book, he wrote down the answers to the questions that the geriatrician asked him. The geriatrician always asked him the same thing, like, what's your name? Where do you live? Who's the president? And I found this list of answers in his briefcase when I came to kind of clean up. And it wrote like Barack Obama, and I'm like, what could these be? And then I realized these were the questions. And so he would go through the questions, and then he would always tell my dad, you're my best patient, and like usher him out because, they just want their money, obviously. So
Mhm.
no, Marianne, no one was overseeing him. And I was that clueless person who did not push, right? Nobody was overseeing him. And we had neighbors who would like look in on him. But again, I had a bad relationship with my dad. And so it wasn't like I was like, I would go visit him like maybe once a year, but I didn't catch him. No one was looking at it. I am the poster child of how to not care for an elder who would be vulnerable to getting dementia. So there was nobody there. The only way my dad got diagnosed was when he had to go for rehab and stayed for a couple months. He'd gotten a UTI. It was the staff at the rehabilitation center that did all kinds of tests on him, and then they were like, something's off. That was when he got diagnosed. His geriatrician never acknowledged it. And by that time, he stayed in that rest home for a while, but at one point they were understaffed, and my dad even ran away for about 4 hours from the place. So he did not get good care at all, and that was all part of why we decided we're going to bring him to Peru for quality hands-on care, and we're just going to accept the initial rough part of the journey. So does that answer the question, Marianne?
Yeah, that's just like really interesting because I had the same experience with my stepfather, and then also like what you had said earlier was, he was difficult and he got more difficult, and you just thought he was being a PIA, and that's exactly how I felt about Fred. And then when I tried to get him diagnosed, I think the doctor was reluctant to go there. He didn't want to go there because he liked my parents. He liked them very much, and they liked him. And so that was a problem. So we had to get another doctor. So if people who listen to the podcast have heard my story and my advice that, yes, you do have permission
Yes.
to fire the doctor and to find
Interesting.
help elsewhere if you're not getting the answers you need. So that's, yeah, that we share that in common. And the other question I have for you, because you said he was under the illusion that his insurance was paying for his care. And obviously that couldn't have been, because I don't think Medicare covers any care in South America. And
Yeah, no, yeah.
how did you work that out?
Yeah, so I've been asked about how did the money work? About 4 years ago, Minding Our Elders interviewed me. They did a two-part series on it, and that was what Carol, who runs that, was very interested in. Like, how did you work this? So no, Medicare is not going to cover you if you go to South America. And my father had all these supplemental plans. He worked for the post office, so he had American Postal Workers Union, and then he had some other thing. My father had American insurance, like 3 of them, but his care was so affordable in Peru that we didn't need it.
Wow.
He was you. If you're younger than 80, you can actually get insurance in Peru. But my dad was 86 when he first came.
Oh, wow.
So, but everything was like so affordable. Both the at-home care and also the doctor's visits. The city is set up that if you're elderly, doctors will come to you. It's like something out of Leave It to Beaver. Like, they'll ring the front doorbell and there the doctor will be. Those visits would cost between the equivalent of United States US dollars, like $70 US and $80. And there's the doctor. And then they even did like neurological tests there. I can have blood drawn in the house. But all told, both the cost for his 2 nurses' aides and the doctors, it worked out to being like about $1,500 a month. And my father had a pension from the Postal Workers Union. So it worked. So monetarily it worked, but it was really good for dementia, caring for someone with dementia, because he didn't have to leave for his care. It was all done there. And any caregiver knows how hard it is to sometimes just get somebody dressed and out the door. This can be like the big accomplishment of your day. And so my dad would just be in that same room. So that worked out really, really well for us. And again, we didn't fully understand how well set up this particular South American city was for caring for someone at home, but it's just that tradition. And I believe these things that we experienced down there, being able to have, like, they would drive to your house with the medications. The doctors would come. They would do all that. These are things that could be implemented more in the United States to help at-home caregivers. And again, someone who's never cared for someone with dementia doesn't realize just how monumental the task of getting someone to the doctors is, right?
Oh, for sure.
Right?
That's like an hour. I mean, I was working full time, and my mom would have an appointment, and at this point they were living in assisted living, and I'd call the facility and say, "Can you make sure my mom's ready at such and such a time?" Like, I thought it would just be, it's like ordering takeout, right? I could just order it, and I'd show up, and she wasn't ready. And they're like, "Well, we did our best." And I'm like, "All right." But I mean, literally, it can be, it's so, and one of our authors that we lost recently, Wendy, she talked about that on one of our podcasts. She shared with her daughters, "Let me do the things I can do." And it may take me 30 minutes to put my coat on, but
Ah,
give me that time.
ah,
And it's realizing when you're caregiving for somebody with dementia to just really, it's all different. And you do have to make those adjustments, but you're right, getting somebody, so having a doctor come to the home, what a gift.
it was really a gift. Yeah. And then it turned out again in that particular South American city, a lot of the doctors had trained in the United States. Like they would go to conferences in the US, they would give conferences. My father saw like the head neurologist from the big neurology institute in Lima. He would come and do that. So it really was a gift. But again, it's everything when you caregive, this was my experience, everything is like one day at a time. So you're like,
Yes.
yay, my win. He got dressed or he did this. Like it reminds me it reminded me a lot of caring for a toddler because
Yeah.
it's the same thing. Like, toddlers, sometimes you put on an outfit, then they take them off, and it's like you're running around in circles. So, yeah,
And today they can do it and tomorrow they can't. So that happens as well.
right.
And you raised another issue, and we won't go on to this a lot, but I'm fascinated with the that you have these doctors in Peru, in Lima, that are so well educated about a lot of different things, and
Mhm.
yet and they're going to the US for these conferences and learning these things, and yet your geriatrician in the United States wasn't, and that has been my experience too, that a lot of primary care physicians and there are not even a lot of geriatricians left, to be honest with you. No one's going into
Mhm.
that field.
Right.
And so a lot of physicians are not very well trained in aging, and then
Right.
they might have more of a mentality of, how do we medicate it? How do we fix it from
Mhm.
a Western medicine point of view?
Mhm.
And that's cutting it out or medicating it,
Right. Right.
and it just, and that's something that I think maybe will shift as people, we're having
Mhm.
so many more people living so much longer. And unfortunately, so many more people developing dementia. It's a crisis point I think we're coming to, but yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it? So I don't have a question there. It was a comment, but
No,
I
no,
found that really
I
interesting that you were
thank,
talking about it.
yeah, thank you for bringing that up, Christy. Honestly, I was enraged at my father's, geriatrician. I was really enraged at
Hmm.
him.
Sure.
But when you're caregiving, like the American me was like, I'm gonna sue him because he didn't say anything. And then, like he actually owned the rehab center when my dad ran away,
Mm,
and like all that. But when you're caregiving and you're just trying to figure out, especially in the beginning, it's like I didn't have time for that. Like I just had
yeah,
to solve the problem. There was just like a lot of
right.
problem solving. But yeah, it is the huge irony that the aging specialist did not catch the dementia or would not or participated in the grand illusion. And that's why I think like resources like us authors and talking to people, it's like if there's anything that I could say, like when you know meet people and they have an elder, and you guys, Marianne and Christy, you must hear, like you probably meet people with an elder in their lives and you're like, I think they might have dementia, like they need to do things different. And then you're like, please listen to me. But we are so conditioned in the US to listen to the doctors. And yet, dementia is so complex and the solutions require such a rearrangement of lives that often the doctors, they're like, I don't know, like Mr. Drake, my father, he's coming up with the right answers for these questions. He, quote, doesn't have dementia.
Right.
Meanwhile, my dad's reading off a cheat sheet.
Yes, yes,
Hmm.
yes.
Mhm.
Yeah, it can be very frustrating.
People
Now,
with dementia
Barbara,
they're very canny too,
Yes.
my stepfather was like that because I remember them asking the doctor would say, do you know what day it is? And he'd say, I don't work. Why do I have to know that? And that was
Right.
a good answer. I don't know.
Right.
I don't work. Why do I know the day? I don't have to know that. I mean, He was good at evading all those questions.
Good at evading. And Marianne, the thing that I just heard you say was there was like a little bit of humor and like, you're like,
Exactly.
how could
Right.
somebody with such a sassy comeback like be cognitively impaired? Like it's more like,
Yes.
ooh, kind of like adapting, you know?
Yeah.
When my mother was asked who's the president, my mother, a very, very staunch Republican, she said, "Well, I know his name, but I just don't want to say it." And she was like,
Yeah.
"I didn't vote for him," and I'm like,
Oh,
"Oh my
yeah.
gosh, Mom!" So she dodged that one. The doctor just looked at me and smirked. I was like, "Yeah, all right, okay."
That's so funny.
Yeah, and also like what I see in your story, Christy, is somebody who's become used to like evading the questions with like a little comeback. It's like falling back on those resources of engaging with people. Like the info went out of your head, but yeah, and it's
Right.
candy. My father would do that too. So again, all these things,
Yes.
how can you like the medical system is not set up to like, like strap the person to a chair and like you answer this straight. No, like it's a short little appointment.
I think they're relieved when they don't get, have to make that
Mhm.
determination. It's a lot less work and a lot less paperwork and all of that,
Yeah.
So I think it is MRI.
And it's got to be, it's also, I mean, on giving our physicians a little bit here, it's got to be a really hard thing to, like, you don't want to make that diagnosis, right? You don't want to tell a family
Right.
member this is what it is. So, that doesn't mean we shouldn't be more honest about it, but I don't
I've
think
been told that.
but yeah, it's hard.
I was told that they don't want to put that on the record. And
Right.
then it makes them hard to place. I'm like, how are they hard to place? Everybody has dementia in the place. But that's what they told me.
Barbara, so is it just you, or do you have siblings that were involved or helping, or aunts, uncles, cousins?
I'm an only child.
Okay,
So it fell on
yeah.
me. It completely fell on me. And
Yeah, that's wow.
at the time, I felt a little resentful. Like I had some fantasy in my head of like, oh, if I only had siblings to help. Since then, I've learned that people can be on wildly different pages. And I think it's not everybody who has cooperative siblings or siblings who want to help or whatever. So I did not have any family, like blood family to help me, but my husband was incredibly, incredibly supportive and
Yeah.
Melted Away, my book, partly, I mean, I didn't want to make my husband a superhero, but honestly, his help was so critical to everything. I mean, he was the one who helped coordinate things, who would drive to the care home with, all the diaper cream and the diapers in the back. I joked that if we had been stopped by the police at any time and they'd asked to look in the trunk, it would have been open it up and it's full of like Huggies and stuff like that. But no, I did not have any help from anyone but my husband. But my husband was truly amazing, an amazing resource for us.
I would imagine, and you say he is Peruvian, correct?
Yeah.
So he was, I would assume, and you can tell us more, was he like your cultural ambassador to help you understand and integrate?
Thank you. Yeah, he was definitely my cultural ambassador. He had left the country 30 years earlier and come to the United States, gone to school in the United States, and had not considered himself particularly Peruvian. But really, I did rely on him. And I would say for anybody who's ever thinking about maybe doing elder care in another country, you need to know the language, at least on some kind of intermediate level. But you do also need to understand the culture. That's really important. So he did help me understand a lot. But his going back was returning to Peru in 2007 for my husband was a really big transition for him too.
Yeah.
He had remembered that Peru had a guerrilla movement, a terrorist movement called Shining Path. And most of us Americans, we're not really aware of the culture of South America. It's like, I don't know what's going on down there. But this was a really big thing. It was a Maoist terrorist movement, started in the 70s. And by the early 80s, there were bombings, there were assassinations. It was very, very violent. And So
Wow.
my husband left during that time. He hadn't been targeted, but a lot of the economy of Peru just ground to a stop, and your opportunities ground to a stop. So my husband, his uncle was a vice admiral in the Navy, and he got passage on a boat, a naval boat that came and it went to Galveston, Texas. So he went through the Panama Canal, and then he got off in Louisiana and sold some Peruvian artifacts and launched his life here in the United States. He was like about 19 years old. So when we went back to Peru, we had visited a little, and him living there, it was like a big period of acculturation. So he was getting to know his country again after it had survived this 25 years of the war. But definitely my
Wow.
husband did help with the acclimatation and all that.
Wow. I mean, my goodness, Barbara, you could write another book. That was fascinating just listening to that. That was amazing. I
Oh,
mean, that is incredibly fascinating. But yes, he was helpful to you and that not even helpful, just like,
mhm.
your point person, your person who got you through all of it. I think that's fantastic.
Thank you.
That's
Thank you. Yeah.
fantastic.
And also it really helped with translation. You move anywhere you go in South America. I don't know if you guys have ever gone down there. Every country has, like, everyone's speaking Spanish except for Brazil, obviously, but they all have their own slang. So I would not understand a lot of the slang, and he would help me like know what people were saying. But one of the things is, I would say that I was in my 40s at the time. If you have to learn another language in your 40s, just be prepared to make an idiot of yourself all the time. You have to have a really good sense of humor, because I was always putting my foot in my mouth, saying ridiculous things, not understanding slang. I mean, I'm not going to go and tell you the things I said because you're recording it. But just let's say that I would try my best and maybe order things in restaurants, and I would end up saying a really bad word covered with cream sauce. And then, like, so yeah, he saved me on a number of those things. But my Spanish did get better. But yeah, he was an amazing help. And again, as you know, with caregiving, it's really a test of how other people are there for you. And
Yes.
I
Yes.
would say that forever I will be grateful to my husband for standing by me. When I came back, I was teaching English at a language institute at the University of Florida, and I had a coworker from Hong Kong, and she found out about this. She goes, "Your husband stuck through you when you brought your father into your house?" And I said, "Yeah." She goes, "Oh, I know a lot of people they would have divorced over a thing like that, right?"
Mm,
Yeah.
That's
yeah.
amazing. I wanted to ask you, how did your father handle the language difference?
Great question. My father didn't know a speck of Spanish moving down there. It was probably um, one of our biggest worries. I mean, how disorienting would that be to move to a place where you don't speak the language? Um, so I have actually an excerpt from it that you can see the closeness through his aides. Well, his doctor spoke English, which I think was really useful for them assessing him. But his aides they tried to learn some English, and it was kind of funny. They were learning the English, but they would watch soap operas with my dad, and we had cable service, and we got Discovery Channel in English, because I'm like, I want my dad to know like what he's watching. But when we go away, they would switch the channels to the soap operas in Spanish. And then I'd come back, and there they would be. And I was mad, and I would turn it back. And I'm like, Senor John, Mr. John wants to watch Discovery Channel. But interestingly enough, he ended up learning beginning Spanish, both understanding it and responding. And that was phenomenal. And I met Dr. Francis Collins at an Alzheimer's Association conference, and I told him about this. He's like, "Yeah, it depends on how the disease progresses, but the area in the back of our brains, Wernicke area, which is the receptor to language, not necessarily to produce it, that area often is affected later." So that's why my dad was able to learn things like sí, like yes, no, like leche, warm, hot, like he started to be able to communicate in Spanish by the end, and that was one of the most miraculous things. I never would have expected that. And
Wow.
yeah, so one of the upsides is my dad with advancing Alzheimer's learned Spanish in Peru.
It's interesting because a lot of people who come from other countries come here and they learn a lot of language from American television, right? That's
Yes,
where they learn it. And soap operas are big on that because it's pretty predictable language. You can kind of
right,
figure out pretty quickly what's happening.
right.
It's fascinating. Wow, that's
Mm.
amazing. Um, you know, with all that you've been talking about, how do you feel or what are you aware of? How has your dementia journey changed you?
Mhm. Well, my the dementia journey changed me so much, as well as my relationship with my father and with kind of my relationship with my history with my father. Um, the first draft of the book that I wrote, that was a number of years ago, really focused on the caregiving journey, and it was actually much more upbeat. I used to have a blog called A Peruvian Alzheimer's Adventure, and nobody don't go there, anybody, because it doesn't exist. I had to take it down. But a lot of it was actually helping people who wanted to care for a loved one in Latin America. So there were resources if you wanted to go to Mexico and to this, and it was, I guess it was a lot more practical like that. But because I no longer lived in Latin America, I felt like it would not be the, I had to kind of take it down because I couldn't go and kind of check myself. And a friend of mine read and she's a memoirist and a novelist. Her name is Jill Cement. She's a wonderful, wonderful writer. She read my first draft and she's like, well, I don't understand enough about your relationship with your father. And I went, oh my God. So I didn't have anything about how difficult my relationship was. It was much more
Sure.
like upbeat. And as both of you know, as authors, you can write a book about your caregiving journey. Maybe 2 years later, you'd write a different book because you start to see it in a different way. So I thought, you want to know about my relationship with my dad? So when I went and I meditated on it, I realized that a lot of the resentment that I had held toward him, because basically my dad had held me to the standard and he just did not want me to be a writer. And he was very cantankerous and he disowned me for being a writer and all this stuff. So the process of caring for my dad and bringing into my home the person who'd kind of become my nemesis and being with him, what it did was it enabled me to see him for the flawed human being that he was, and not the kind of angry, vindictive monster that I had imagined maybe as a child or in my teens or my early 20s. I saw him more for his vulnerabilities, and the choice of deciding to care for somebody with whom I had a difficult relationship, that was a personal choice. I decided that. Um, and I think that decision and sticking with it and having the help in Peru enabled me to give up a lot of my resentments toward him. And again, I'm not saying that everybody who has a hard relationship with a parent has to become a caregiver. It's very individual, your decision. You might just put them in a caregiving home. There's no right answer for anyone. But for me, because I had all that hands-on help in the home, it kind of freed me to be with him and not have to do all the hard physical labor of it. And it enabled me to go back and revisit that relationship. You mentioned at one point, this was before we even started recording this, about how it's hard to refer to if someone is a loved one, if you had a hard relationship with them. I ultimately did connect with my early love for my dad.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. I'm
Yeah.
not going to say I quote forgive him. Some people are amazing. They have like a spirit that enables them to like forgive, right? Um, I wouldn't say that I exactly forgave him for all the things that he did. I just wasn't haunted by it anymore. I was not haunted by it. And I knew that he had made decisions in his past with me. I disagreed with them. And when it was my chance, I decided to be compassionate. And that's why I believe it was transformative. And so again, I'm not saying everybody has to become hands-on caregivers or whatever, but I think that it can be an opportunity to reflect on a relationship, do things differently, and to come to terms with your past in a much different way.
Well,
So
that's
beautiful.
so beautiful, and you really I love how you say it wasn't maybe forgiveness, and we think that it's very black and white, right? I'm angry, I forgive them, but maybe it's just you chose compassion as much for yourself, I suspect, as for your dad, and you chose not to let stuff from the past be your present. And that's a big choice, and that's a difficult choice. But in hearing you talk about it, it sounds like it was a very healthy and healing choice for yourself. And I totally agree with you. That's not how everybody has to do it. That's not a prescription. But what an interesting perspective. So
What we've
thank you for
heard,
sharing that.
what we've heard from many of the authors here is that that's one of the blessings of Alzheimer's or dementia, is that the person has changed, and in many ways you're able to repair your relationship because they are no longer who they once were. One of the authors, Susan Cummings, said in her 6-word memoir, she calls it The Upside to Alzheimer's New Mother, because she never had a loving, caring relationship with her mother until her mother had Alzheimer's. And if she hadn't stuck around for that, she wouldn't have had that. And she's not the only one. There's several authors who have experienced that. So, I mean, it is encouraging to people who might be on the brink of making that decision to maybe look at the bright side or try anyway. Try and see if you can repair your relationship.
Yeah. It is definitely a beautiful thing to think about. We heard this from Susan Davis also recently on our one of our more recent special events, and it's the same. It's a very similar tale of I was able to see her differently, and also she changed, and so it sounds that your dad, how did he change then in that regard? In terms of being cantankerous. Did he continue to be cantankerous?
My dad, who was a self-absorbed, narcissistic jerk, was never such a nice person as when he was finally treated for Alzheimer's and cared for in Peru. All right? Okay?
Wow.
A lot of people are not going to say this, but I had the best relationship with my dad. Okay, so obviously it was painful because I could see him lose abilities and lose ability to understand. And of course, they were very, very scared about things. My dad really did transform. And part of that was also because he got the right care down there. If I had been more on top of it in the United States, if I had listened to my friend who is a nurse who observed my father before we went to Peru, and she's like, Barbara, I don't think he's doing that well. And I'm like, nah, he's fine. He's in his own home. Maybe I could have gotten the right care for him. But my father, when he was medicated, but he had all that great hands-on help. He had a very stable routine. Okay, I think routine is really important for people with dementia because there's so many unknowns they're grappling with. But the same thing, because of what we gave him, the care, it stabilized him. He had lots of love. His caregivers were really loving. And initially I was like, why are these ladies so nice to him? Why are they holding his hand? Why are they stroking his arm? Why are they so incredibly patient? I was used to much more transactional nurses in the United States. They were loving. Con cariño is the phrase with love in Spanish. Cariño, which is like loving affection. It was just natural down there. It was that human touch. And that human touch and just somebody who's willing to tend to you and be patient with you. If it takes you half an hour to walk up the few steps to get into the door, like it was that. But you asked how my father changed. My father let go of being self-sufficient. He relaxed into these women's arms, into their hands. He regained the ability to laugh at himself, which he never had before. Like my dad had no sense of humor before this. He was always like very serious. And he was not a guy who could laugh at himself, unlike my mother. But he regained a sense of humor. I mean, it sounds almost like too much of a fairy tale, but honestly, being cared for properly in this culture, very human contact culture, my dad was never so nice. And that, of course, made it easier to be around my dad. And
Wow.
I will not say that I had anticipated this at all. We did it for the money originally, Christy. I mean, that was why we brought him there. But all these other things were the benefits that I had never imagined. And as Marianne was saying, you can often, caring for someone can be a real gift, but you don't think of it at the time because you're just trying to get through each day. But that was it.
Yeah,
Thank you.
absolutely.
Did you come prepared to read something from your book?
Yeah, I did. I'm going to read a very short, it's a couple of paragraphs from the center of the book. You see if I can get it up on the screen here. It's from a section of the book called On Even Keel. And this is a caregiving excerpt. When I talk about this book to people, they're very interested in the stuff about climate change or the cross-cultural stuff. The caregiving stuff, unless you've been through it, people don't understand as much. But this short excerpt comes from the section of the book when my dad has finally gone through that worst phase. We found the right caregivers for him, which was an ordeal in itself. And this describes some of the things that we talked about. It's about 3 paragraphs long. It's a section called Their Hands. So it takes place in Lima. It's sort of during the stable section. Their Hands. Some evenings, I entered my father's room and found him and the aides sitting together on the couch, holding hands and watching a telenovela. They sat side by side in the semi-darkness, their faces bathed in the blue glow of the TV. Daisy, that's one of his aides, stared plaintively at the screen, her dark eyes absorbed in the unfolding drama. Her soft arm rested on a pillow propped between them, fingers intertwined with his. If Alma, that's his other aide, was watching him, she delicately patted his hand from time to time. My father looked peaceful, his face a contented blank. They could sit for hours like this, chastely, like children on a pretend date. Eventually, my father's head would nod, and he began to snore. He would sleep there, upright, or the aide would transition him into the bed. As the months went by, my father became more trusting of these women's hands. They were there to guide him to the bathroom, to walk him around the perimeter of the dining room, to dab his nose when it was runny. In his former life, he would visibly stiffen when someone went to hug him. Just the possibility of someone touching his comb-over made him wince. Now he sat tranquilly in the lounge chair as Daisy snipped at his balding pate with a pair of ornate barber's scissors. The newly sharpened blades flickered around his large ears. He stared out the back window at Pizarro's fig tree, regally, like he had all the time in the world. When Daisy was through, she would dab the fringe with hair gel, Ego for Men brand, and comb it neatly into place, his bald skull exposed. She stepped back to survey her work. Finis, Mr. John. Really? He asked, brow furrowing as he looked up at her. Si, finito. Senora Lucinda, that was their cook, poked her head into the room and joined us. Daisy knelt in front of my father, pinching his cheek. Muy guapo, she said coyly. Did he know what guapo meant? I explained that it was handsome. Ooh, he said, obviously pleased. Guapo repeated, pointing at him. Daisy, guapo, he said, pointing at her. No, soy guapa, she corrected him, emphasizing the ah sound of the second syllable. Daisy, guapa. John, guapo. Daisy, guapa, he repeated. The women laughed, pleased. Holy shit, I thought. Were they teaching him Spanish? And it goes on.
That's great.
That was great. I love that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So can you tell us where the listeners may be able to find you, your website, social media, all that stuff?
Thank you. Yeah. I have a website. It's my whole name, barbaradrakeVera.com. Has information about the book, links to the independent bookstores where I have signed copies. It's also available on Amazon through bookshop.org. There's a local new bookstore, independent bookstore in my city of Gainesville called The Links, where I have signed copies. It's also available Barnes and Nobles at all those places.
Awesome.
Fantastic. Fantastic. It's been such a delight. I just want to invite you to tell us, is there anything that we didn't ask that you wanted to share? Anything else important that you want us to know?
Thank you. Just listeners, I feel you if you're in the caregiving trenches. We may never have met, but those of us who've been through it, we're like part of an army. We're all wearing purple today. We're part of that purple army, and it's like you don't have to say a word, and we're all here for you. I just wanted to mention that All's Authors is an incredible resource for people. I mean, these memoirs and maybe like kind of like disguised memoirs, novels that people have written, these are front-hand accounts of what it's really like. And I think that very practical books are really helpful as far as like, how do you dress? Convince someone to get dressed when they have Alzheimer's and all that. But it's the emotional journey of being a caregiver that I believe memoirs and kind of like fictionalized memoirs can help you with the best, because you're going to see you're not alone with your reactions, with your anger, with your frustration, with your confusion. This is like a light that guides the way. And so I guess I'm doing a plug for Alzheimer's, but
We'll take it.
Yeah,
We'll take it. That's great.
there's nothing like it. There's just absolutely nothing like it. And so if I would want to say to my fellow caregivers, find one of these books that kind of mirrors what you're going through, get it. If you have a friend, get them the book, even if they're like in denial and they think it's not going to happen to them. It's like, get them one of these books. It's their entree, and it's the narrative that's going to pull you along, and you're going to know that person got through it. I can get through it too. That's the thing I wanted to say.
Oh, that's awesome. Thank you so much. Really appreciate that.
Yeah,
Yes.
thank you. And thank you so much for having me here today. My book is a hybrid memoir, so it covers both caregiving and climate change and kind of overcoming personal trauma. But thank you so much for welcoming me into the family. I love what you do. I love the work that you, Marianne, and Christy and Jean put into making this resource available. I think it's one of the best things. I was an ambassador for North Central Florida for the Alzheimer's Association for many years. And I like the work the Alzheimer's Association does as far as like getting, like funding and all this. But I think ultimately, like, my passion is for helping the caregiver. And your organization and your resources are giving caregivers what they need, right? And it's that personal connection. So I'm very proud to be part of it. And thank you so much for welcoming me today.
Well,
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
That means a lot. Thank you for listening to Untangling Alzheimer's and Dementia, an All's Authors podcast. For more details on this episode, please see the show notes. If you enjoyed the podcast, please leave a review and subscribe to it on whichever platform you use to listen to your favorite podcasts.
For more information on All's Authors, please visit allsauthors.com. While you're there, be sure to browse our online bookstore, where you will find hundreds of carefully vetted books on Alzheimer's and dementia. You can also find us on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. Please email your thoughts on the podcast to allsauthors@gmail.com. We are a 501c3 charitable organization, totally reliant on donations to do what we do. If our authors' stories move you, please consider contributing to our cause. Remember, you are not alone. One can sing a lonely song, but we chose to form a choir and create harmony.
Caregiving is a challenge, whether your person has dementia or not. Finding helpful tips and learning new strategies from people in the know is critical. That's why we at Al's Authors love the Happy Healthy Caregiver podcast from Elizabeth Miller, who also happens to be an Al's author. Elizabeth speaks from experience and has important and often fun conversations with other caregiving experts and professionals. And we appreciate learning tips on self-care, discovering new resources, and feeling empowered to support ourselves as caregivers. You can find the Happy Healthy Caregiver podcast wherever you download your favorite podcasts, or visit the website happyhealthycaregiver.com.